In the year 1287 BC, when the sun rose slowly over the vast golden deserts that stretched between the empire of Arathen and the dominion of Selukar, the world felt heavier than usual, as if the sky itself sensed that something ancient and forgotten had begun to stir beneath the sands, and the desert winds carried with them whispers of unease that swept through every village, fortress, and palace hall across both empires. Because for the first time in living memory, entire border settlements had fallen silent without explanation, not destroyed or burned, simply abandoned, as though their people had stepped out of existence, leaving behind meals half prepared, tools lying where they were last held, and doors left wide open to the desert wind. And in the capital of Arathen, King Raymor stood inside the Hall of Nine Pillars, listening to frightened advisors argue loudly over who was responsible, though their fingers always pointed toward Selukar, their oldest rival. Even though deep inside Raymor's heart, he felt an unease that had nothing to do with politics, an instinct telling him that Selukar was not behind these disappearances. Yet fear speaks louder than truth, and to calm the council, he ordered scouts to investigate, while blacksmiths forged weapons through the night and soldiers marched restlessly, whispering to one another about strange lights seen in the sky, faint symbols found etched into the sand, and travelers who claimed that shadows moved across the dunes after sunset. Meanwhile, across the burning plains, Emperor Varuk of Selukar faced the same fear as his own council demanded action, presenting identical reports of missing caravans, mysterious patterns in the earth, and an unnatural stillness settling over the frontier. And although Varuk knew Arathen would not provoke war without reason, his generals insisted the disappearances were deliberate acts of aggression, forcing him to strengthen border outposts and prepare for the worst. And while these two empires tightened their grips on suspicion, a young scholar named Maelor in the hidden archives of Arathen uncovered a cracked clay tablet buried beneath centuries of dust, a relic etched with an ancient prophecy, warning of a war of mirrors, a conflict shaped not by ambition or hatred, but by a force that manipulated both sides into believing the other was responsible. And as Maelor translated the prophecy by torchlight, the desert outside seemed to shift with an unsettling rhythm, as though the land responded to the awakening of something old. And the very next night, soldiers stationed on watchtowers reported streaks of pale light crossing the sky in silence, disappearing as quickly as they came, causing entire battalions to fall into fearful confusion. And before anyone could make sense of the phenomenon, an Arathen patrol vanished during routine scouting near the shattered ridge, while a Selukar trade convoy disappeared the same night, leaving no tracks, no dropped supplies, no evidence of conflict. Nothing but an empty silence so deep that both councils reacted out of pure fear, believing these coordinated vanishings could only mean the other empire had struck first. And with this belief, the machinery of war began to turn, drums echoing across fortresses, messengers riding at full speed between capitals, soldiers tightening armor straps, and citizens rushing to gather supplies, as the tension spread through streets like a rising storm. But even as preparations escalated, Maelor ran through the corridors of Arathen's palace, clutching the ancient tablet with trembling hands, hoping he could reach the king before war became unavoidable. Though outside the palace walls, the desert wind grew unnaturally still, as if it awaited the first spark. And beneath the twin moon's cold glow, the armies of both empires unknowingly marched toward a conflict shaped not by their own choices, but by a shadow older than their histories, a force buried deep beneath sands that had witnessed civilizations rise and fall. And as the moonlight stretched across the dunes, the world itself seemed to hold its breath, preparing for a war that would shake the ancient world and blur the line between legend and truth forever, marking the beginning of a fate neither empire could escape. The desert night had barely faded into pale morning light,
when the first divisions of Arathen's frontier army reached the vast borderlands known as the Shattered Ridge, a place of broken stone towers and ancient cliffs carved by time, where the wind carried a permanent low hum that travelers claimed was the voice of forgotten spirits. And as Commander Theros led his troops across the sand, he felt that same hum vibrating beneath his boots, a strange pulse that seemed to echo through the ground with each step. And although Theros was a veteran of countless campaigns, even he could not shake the unease that crawled across the back of his mind as he studied the unusual stillness that stretched before them. For this region was normally alive with caravan traffic, wandering herders, and desert patrols. But now it felt abandoned, stripped of life, as though the world had paused just long enough to let something slip into its silence. And before Theros could issue new orders, a messenger approached him with news that scouts had discovered the location where the missing patrol was last seen, a narrow stretch of canyon carved into the ridge. But when the commanders arrived, they found no footprints, no equipment, no broken weapons, no signs of a struggle, only the faint imprint of something circular pressed into the sand, unlike any symbol known in Arathen or Selukar records. And this discovery spread like wildfire through the ranks, stirring whispers among the soldiers who already feared that the desert itself was awakening. And while Arathen troops explored the ridge with growing caution, far across the plains, Selukar's northern legions were reaching the opposite border at almost the same time, marching under the banners of the Black Sun, guided by General Arathen, a strict yet strategic leader who often trusted logic over superstition. Yet even he felt an uncomfortable stirring as he observed his troops scanning the desert with nervous expressions, because Selukar scouts too had discovered a strange sight: the empty remains of the missing caravan, the sand around it untouched except for a faint shimmering dust that sparkled in the sunlight before vanishing with every gust of wind. And despite Arathen's attempts to keep his soldiers focused, many whispered that they had angered ancient powers buried beneath the sand, powers misunderstood by both empires and ignored for too long. And as these unsettling signs multiplied, the councils of both Arathen and Selukar continued to collapse into panic, sending out command after command, urging their armies to hasten their formations at the frontier before the enemy could acquire more ground. And while warriors sharpened their weapons and erected temporary outposts, the desert itself began to show even stranger behavior. Distant echoes that did not match the wind, shifting patterns on dune faces that erased themselves by dawn, and faint glimmers that appeared like distant fires but vanished upon approach, leaving soldiers from both sides even more confused, unsure whether the other empire was responsible or whether something else entirely lurked beyond their understanding. Meanwhile, in the heart of Arathen's capital, Maelor rushed across the palace grounds, gripping the cracked prophecy tablet so tightly his fingers trembled, weaving through guards and advisors while trying to reach King Raymor before the war orders became irreversible. And when he finally gained entry to the king's chambers, breathless and pale, he laid out the translated prophecy before Raymor, explaining that the War of Mirrors described on the tablet spoke of an unseen force manipulating two great empires by creating illusions, distortions, and disappearances that would push both nations into believing the other had struck first. A force ancient enough to be tied to the earliest myths written on stone long before Arathen built its first city walls. And although Raymor listened intently, his advisors grew frustrated, claiming superstition could not override the reality of lost soldiers and missing citizens, and the council insisted that every passing moment without retaliation placed the empire at greater risk, forcing Raymor into a painful conflict between reason and instinct. Yet as the council continued to pressure him, the palace trembled faintly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for everyone in the chamber to feel a ripple beneath the floor. And although the tremor lasted only a heartbeat, Maelor recognized it immediately as the same pulse described in the prophecy, a sign that the ancient force had awakened fully, a sign that both empires were walking directly into its plan. Across the desert, as Arathen's and Selukar's armies unknowingly marched closer to one another, the sky began to darken unusually early, the sun dimming behind a veil of thin, shifting clouds that moved in ways no natural wind could explain. And soldiers from both sides paused to stare upward, some tightening their grips on their spears, others whispering prayers to long-forgotten gods, as the horizon flickered with faint streaks of silver light, light that twisted like threads of smoke before vanishing with unnatural silence. And although Commander shouted for everyone to remain calm, the truth echoed through every nervous breath. The desert was no longer behaving like a desert, the sky no longer like the sky, and something unseen had begun shaping the world around them, nudging two ancient empires toward a collision that neither truly desired but could no longer escape. And as the first night fell over both armies, settling them into uneasy camps where fires flickered weakly and watchmen scanned the dunes with shaking hands, a deep and distant hum rose again from beneath the sand, louder than before, vibrating through tents, armor, and stone. A hum that belonged not to man, not to wind, but to something awakening, something older, greater, and waiting for the moment the two empires crossed paths so it could reveal itself at last.
Under the rising glow of a pale sun that crept slowly across the sky like a silent witness to the old world's hidden tensions, the vast plains between the forgotten empire of Corydon and the iron dominion of Selukar stretched endlessly, shimmering with dust that drifted in lazy spirals each time a faint wind brushed across the ancient soil. And as that wind whispered through the brittle grasslands, it carried with it the scent of something uneasy, something stirring beneath centuries of rivalry, something that neither empire knew how to confront with calm, because behind every movement, every message, every rumor that crossed their borders lay the weight of old promises and older betrayals. And now, as both sides prepared themselves in their own guarded halls, the world felt as though it had quietly stepped into a moment from which there would be no turning back. And in the heart of Selukar, High Commander Valar stood before a council of seasoned captains, their faces stern and weather-hardened, each one listening closely, as Valar described how the scouts had reported unusual movements along the Corydon frontier, movements that didn't resemble patrols, but rather entire convoys shifting supplies southward, constructing strange wooden structures at night, and lighting no torches to avoid detection. And Valar, with his calm, disciplined voice, explained that this was no mere test of borders, but a sign that Corydon was preparing for something larger, something deliberate. And the council shifted uneasily as he spoke, knowing that Valar had never been wrong about matters of war and diplomacy. Meanwhile, far beyond Selukar's stone halls, across vast dunes and rolling valleys, the Corydon leadership gathered in their own fortress carved from sun-baked limestone, where the young but sharp-minded Queen Arashira traced her fingers over an ancient map, the parchment older than her bloodline, its edges cracked, but its markings still clear enough to show the long-forgotten roots once used in the First Age when both empires were young and reckless. And she listened as her advisors described how Selukar had begun reinforcing their northern passes and sending riders to call back veteran soldiers. And with every new report, Arashira felt the weight of history pressing down upon her, not out of fear, but out of responsibility, because she knew that if conflict returned, it would not be the small skirmishes their ancestors tolerated. It would be a clash shaped by ancient grudges that had slept too long. And as the morning shadows softened, she instructed her generals to prepare diplomatic envoys, not to beg for peace, but to attempt clarity, to ensure no misunderstanding triggered a conflict neither empire could easily contain. Yet even as she spoke those words to her inner circle, she sensed that the momentum had already begun slipping beyond their grasp, because the plains between them had become a stage for misread signals, and neither side was willing to stand idle while the other appeared to advance. And across the frontier zone, travelers whispered of strange lights flickering at night, of quiet marches happening just beyond eyesight, of envoys that never returned from their journeys. And while some of those stories were exaggerated by fear, others were rooted in truth. For Corydon scouts indeed watched Selukar stockpile water at key wells, and Selukar outriders indeed heard distant hammering from Corydon construction sites. And the result was a landscape tangled in uncertainty, like a bowstring pulled tighter and tighter, waiting for the slightest spark to unleash the storm long predicted in old prophecies known only to scholars. And by the time the sun began sinking into the western horizon, casting endless shadows over the plains, both empires stood closer to a confrontation than they fully realized, not because either side desired war, but because history had placed them in a moment where hesitation felt dangerous and action felt necessary. And so, as the evening settled in, the world once again held its breath, waiting for dawn, waiting for one final misinterpretation, waiting for the event that would ignite the greatest ancient conflict the chronicles would ever remember.
As the first light of dawn broke over the endless plains between the empire of Arathen and the dominion of Selukar, the horizon seemed to shimmer with anticipation, a haze rising off the sand that made distant mountains appear to sway as though breathing, and across that expanse, thousands of soldiers from both empires assembled in silent, tense formations, their armor glinting faintly in the pale morning sun. The banners of Arathen fluttering in shades of gold and deep crimson, while the banners of Selukar swayed with dark obsidian and silver. And as commanders shouted orders that echoed across the valley, every movement was precise, measured, and yet weighted with a sense of inevitability that none could fully understand, because the borderlands had grown charged with something older than memory, older than kings, older than empires. And the soldiers marching forward could feel it in the pressure of the wind, in the vibrations of the ground beneath their feet, in the flicker of the sun on spear tips, in the faint metallic tang in the air that made them swallow hard and glance nervously at their neighbors, while commanders on both sides squinted across the fields, trying to read the enemy, to decipher whether the other side would hold or advance. And in the midst of this tension, Queen Arashira of Arathen, standing atop a ridge to oversee her legions, felt a cold clarity wash over her, a realization that this day would not be like any other battle she had studied in the archives or read of in scrolls, because this was a confrontation that had been written in silence long before either empire's rise, a battle shaped by forces that neither ruler could name. And while she pondered the weight of history pressing on her shoulders, General Arathen of Selukar surveyed the advancing lines of Arathen troops from his high vantage point atop a rocky outcrop, noting their formations, the placement of cavalry, the clustering of archers, the faint glint of bronze shields, and he too felt the unnatural rhythm in the land, a subtle vibration that pulsed beneath stone, sand, and flesh, as though the desert itself were alive, testing both armies' courage, measuring their resolve, and preparing the stage for events that would be told as legend for thousands of years. And as the two forces drew closer, scouts on either side reported strange disturbances, footprints appearing in odd patterns that led nowhere, shadows stretching across the dunes without any source, and faint, whispering echoes in the wind that vanished as soon as anyone listened closely. And while these reports made their way up the chain of command, many dismissed them as desert tricks or superstition. But some soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, gripping their weapons tighter, whispering prayers to gods forgotten, remembering tales told by elders of a force older than man, older than city or throne, a force that only awoke when history was poised on the knife's edge. And as the armies reached the midpoint between their respective camps, the silence broke in sudden waves of motion. War drums rolled across the plains from both sides, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the sand and into the soldiers' bones, while horns blared and messengers dashed along the flanks, carrying orders that would determine the flow of the day. And cavalry shifted into place, infantry braced behind spears and shields. Archers knocked arrows with hands trembling, not from fear alone, but from the awareness of standing in a moment older than themselves. And in that instant, the first clash occurred not with a scream or a volley of arrows, but with a subtle tremor under the ground that caused both armies to pause, looking at one another with uncertainty, sensing that this battlefield was more than a stage for mortal struggle. It was a theater for something vast, timeless, and patient, a presence waiting to see if humans
would follow the instincts of rivalry or the caution of wisdom. And yet no one could retreat now, for both empires had brought not only soldiers, but honor, pride, and centuries of tension into this field. And the first skirmishes ignited as archers released their shafts in long, precise volleys that darkened the morning sky. Spears were lowered and shields locked. Cavalry thundered across the sand in synchronized patterns, and the ground trembled beneath the combined weight of thousands of boots and hooves, while dust and sweat and sunlight mingled into a haze that seemed to blur reality itself, making it difficult to tell which side moved first, which side faltered, which side would gain advantage. And in that haze, commanders shouted, orders clashed, signals flew from flags and horns, and every heartbeat of the soldiers mirrored the growing pulse beneath the desert, a pulse that seemed to dictate the tempo of the battle as much as any human hand. And all the while, Maelor, the young scholar from Arathen, observed from a hidden ridge, the prophecy tablet clutched tightly to his chest, knowing that he had warned the king too late that the war of mirrors had begun in earnest, that the unseen force was now in motion, guiding the decisions, the errors, the victories, the retreats, as if the desert itself had eyes, watching and shaping every outcome. And as midday approached, the battle intensified, becoming a blur of movement and sound. Cavalry colliding with shields and spears, archers releasing precise volleys into advancing ranks, infantry testing formations against relentless charges, commanders shouting strategy and correction through the chaos. Yet always the undercurrent persisted, subtle and unyielding, a rhythm in the sand, a whisper in the wind, a presence in the heat that no human could see but everyone could feel. And as evening approached, both sides, exhausted and weary, drew back to temporary positions in the dust-choked fields, the sound of drums and horns replaced by the occasional barked order, the metallic clang of sharpened swords on stone, and the whispered prayers of soldiers who had glimpsed that pulse beneath the battlefield, that ancient rhythm that had guided this day's chaos from the first step. And as the twin moons rose over the horizon, casting silver light across the battered plains, commanders and kings alike recognized a chilling truth. This was only the beginning, the first chapter in a war that would test the endurance, cunning, and spirit of empires that had stood for centuries, and that history would remember not only for the victories and losses, but for the unseen force that had stirred beneath their feet, shaping every movement and shadow. And as night fell and fires flickered across the camps, every soldier, general, and king felt in their hearts that the war was no longer just between Arathen and Selukar, but between mankind and the ancient, unseen rhythm that had awakened beneath the desert, patient, eternal, and unstoppable. And that tomorrow would bring a storm far greater than today, a storm whose echoes would ripple through history itself.
The dawn broke slowly over the war-torn plains between the empire of Arathen and the dominion of Selukar, casting a pale, silvery light across the battlefield, where the scars of the previous day's clash were etched deep into the sand. Broken spears and dented shields scattered across the ground, the dust from thousands of boots and hooves still hanging heavy in the air. And as the armies mustered once more under their banners, there was an unspoken understanding that today would be unlike any day before, that today the world itself had awakened to witness history being carved into its bones. And from atop the highest ridge of Arathen, Queen Arashira watched her legions, the lines of soldiers tight and disciplined, her archers positioned with deadly precision, her cavalry ready to sweep across the sands, all under the faint glow of the rising sun that glinted off bronze helmets. And she felt the weight of generations pressing down on her, knowing that centuries of rivalry, grudges, and forgotten pacts were about to find their reckoning.
while across the plains, Emperor Varuk of Selukar rode along his own lines, his generals flanking him, noting formations, adjusting positions, preparing for the inevitable clash, aware that every mistake could mean death for thousands. And yet he could not shake the sense that this was no ordinary battle, for even the wind seemed different today, heavier, charged with a pulse that vibrated through the ground, the grass, the very bones of men and horses alike. And soldiers on both sides whispered of shadows moving in the distance, of light flickering where no fire had been set, of faint echoes in the dunes that did not belong to any voice or creature known to the world. And though many dismissed it as fear or exhaustion, others felt that these were signs that the ancient force predicted in the prophecies was now fully awake, guiding, watching, shaping the movements of empires, unseen yet undeniable. And as the sun climbed higher, the first volleys of arrows rained from both sides, the sound of impact echoing off distant cliffs, and the clash of spears against shields rang like thunder across the plains, while cavalry units swept across open fields in blinding arcs, riders urging horses forward with sharp commands, lances poised to strike, and infantry formations tested their endurance against relentless assaults, each side seeking advantage, each side mirroring the other's movements in a deadly precise dance. Yet always beneath the chaos persisted the faint vibration in the ground, the subtle pulse in the wind, the rhythm in the light and shadow, reminding all who could sense it that they were no longer just fighting one another, but something far older, a force that had waited for centuries to shape this conflict according to its own will. And Maelor, the scholar who had once tried to warn King Raymor, now stood at a hidden vantage, eyes wide with fear and awe, clutching the prophecy tablet and realizing fully that every movement on the battlefield, every clash of steel, every shouted command was unfolding exactly as the ancient text had predicted, that the war of mirrors was no longer a warning, but a living reality, and that neither empire would emerge from this field unchanged, for destiny itself had aligned to mark this moment. And as the sun reached its zenith, a sudden heat shimmer rose from the sands, distorting the battlefield, making distant lines appear closer or farther, confusing the soldiers, bending perception, and causing commanders to shout frantic corrections, the arrows to fly in misjudged directions, the cavalry to collide unexpectedly with friendly ranks, chaos threading through the order that had seemed so absolute. Yet even amid confusion, courage, strategy, and instinct pushed both empires forward, the will of kings and generals holding against the subtle manipulations of the unseen force. And as the day wore on, exhaustion began to show, sweat and dust coating the faces of every soldier, horses faltering, weapons chipped and worn, yet no one dared to step back, because to yield now would be to surrender not only to the enemy, but to the invisible power that had orchestrated this calamity. And around midday, a massive clash erupted at the central valley where Arathen infantry met Selukar phalanxes, the sound of impact deafening, the dust rising into towering clouds that swallowed the sun in hazy gray. And from the ridge above, Queen Arashira and Emperor Varuk watched as history itself seemed to convulse. Soldiers moving with blind devotion to orders, generals shouting commands that were almost meaningless against the tide of bodies, while Maelor, trembling, realized the final portion of the prophecy was now unfolding. It spoke of a moment when both empires would recognize the force beyond their control, when leaders would see that the war had been shaped by fate, by rhythm, by a power older than either dynasty. And as the sun dipped toward the western horizon, shadows stretching long and silver across the battlefield, the armies finally began to falter from exhaustion, realizing that victory in the conventional sense would elude them. And in that silence between waves of fighting, an unspoken truce began to root, for both Arathen and Selukar recognized that they were puppets of a deeper, unseen hand. And slowly, cautiously, messengers rode between lines, carrying terms not of surrender, but of understanding, of acknowledgement that the desert, the land, the unseen rhythm had shaped this war, had taught both empires the weight of pride and the cost of misunderstanding. And as night fell, the twin moons rose over the battlefield, casting their pale silver light over the exhausted, battered armies, over the scarred sands where history had left its mark, and over the two rulers, standing tall yet humbled, knowing that the war had changed the world, that the world would remember this moment for thousands of years, and that the war that shook the ancient world was not simply a tale of victory or defeat, but a story of unseen forces, of fate, of human courage facing an incomprehensible rhythm, a story that would echo in song, in stone, in legend, for millennia, reminding every future king, general, and scholar that history itself is alive, patient, and eternal, and that even empires, vast and proud, are only instruments of the greater currents that move through the ages. And as the fires burned low in the camps of both empires, the soldiers finally rested. The wind whispered through the dunes once more, and the desert, silent and eternal, reclaimed its space, having witnessed the first and last clash of a war that had been written long before swords were drawn. And as Maelor finally lowered his prophecy tablet, he understood that though the battle had ended, the story of the War of Mirrors would live forever, etched in memory, in sand, in stars, and in the hearts of those who survived. And that even as empires rebuilt, even as kings returned to their palaces, the pulse beneath the desert would never die, only wait, patient, eternal, unstoppable, for the next moment when history would call upon it again.